The sound came first, sharp, sudden, unmistakable, cutting through the cold Harlem night like a blade across silk. Men froze. Conversations died mid-sentence. Somewhere down the block, a dog stopped barking. In that single instant, everyone understood the same truth at the same time. Something irreversible had just happened, and whoever had caused it had done so without hesitation. On a narrow stretch of pavement just off 116th Street, beneath a flickering street lamp that barely held back the darkness, Bumpy Johnson stood perfectly still. His coat hung heavy on his shoulders. His hat was pulled low. He did not flinch. He did not speak. He did not need to. Because the man who had acted was not just any man. He was Bumpy Johnson's bodyguard. And that single moment, one decision made in less than a heartbeat, would ripple through Harlem, the police department, and the underworld alike. It would redraw invisible lines. It would change how power was negotiated in the streets. And, long after the echo faded, the meaning of that moment would still be debated in back rooms and precinct halls. But to understand why that night mattered, one had to understand who stood there in silence and what Harlem had become by then. By the time the 1930s tightened their grip on New York City, Harlem was no longer just a neighborhood. It was a kingdom built on survival. Jazz spilled from basement clubs. Numbers runners moved with practiced speed. Preachers shouted hope on Sundays while hustlers sold reality on Mondays. Police cruisers rolled through with badges polished and tempers short. White-owned businesses took money out. Black-owned lives absorbed the cost. And in the middle of it all stood Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. He was not the loudest man in the room. He did not posture. He did not threaten. His power came from something far more dangerous: certainty. Bumpy knew the streets because he had grown up on them. He knew violence because he had seen what came after it. And he understood respect not as a demand, but as a currency earned through consistency. He paid people fairly. He protected his territory fiercely. And when outsiders, whether from downtown syndicates or City Hall, tried to humiliate Harlem, Bumpy made sure the message was returned, stamped and unmistakable. By the time the night in question arrived, Bumpy's reputation had already traveled far beyond Lenox Avenue. Mob figures downtown knew his name. Police captains spoke it carefully. Politicians avoided saying it at all. But reputation alone never kept a man alive. That was why Bumpy never walked alone. The bodyguard had come up the hard way. His name was rarely spoken outside the inner circle, and that was by design. He was not a man who sought recognition. He sought clarity. He understood his role with absolute precision. Stay close, watch everything, and act when action was required, no sooner, no later. He had seen what happened when men hesitated. He had seen deals fall apart because someone blinked at the wrong moment. And he had learned that protecting a legend meant sometimes becoming invisible, until suddenly you weren't. That night, the tension had been building long before the street lamp flickered. Word had traveled fast, too fast for comfort. A group had come north with ideas they should have left downtown. They believed Harlem was ready to be pressed, that Bumpy Johnson was stretched thin, distracted, vulnerable. They were wrong, but wrong men often don't realize it until it's too late. The meeting was supposed to be simple, a show of presence, a reminder of boundaries. No shouting, no crowd, just enough pressure to send a message and send it clean. But pressure has a way of revealing character. The voices had risen. The space had tightened. One of the men, new to Harlem, careless with his words, had stepped forward when he should have stepped back. Bumpy had said nothing. That was the warning. Those who knew him understood that silence was not absence. It was assessment. And while eyes were fixed on the legend himself, they failed to notice the bodyguard's shift in posture, the slight change in weight, the angle of his shoulders, the decision already forming behind steady eyes. He was not reacting emotionally. He was responding professionally. When the moment came, it came clean. One sound, one action, one irreversible line crossed, and just like that, the balance changed. In the seconds that followed, no one moved, not because they were ordered to stay still, but because they were unsure of the rules anymore. Bumpy Johnson finally turned his head. His eyes moved across the faces in front of him, measuring not fear, but understanding. He spoke calmly, his voice low enough that only those close could hear. "This is over," he said, not a threat, not a boast, a statement of fact. The men who had come to test Harlem left differently than they arrived, quieter, smaller, carrying with them the weight of a lesson they would not soon forget. And by morning, the story had already begun to change. Some said it was an accident. Some said it was inevitable. Some said it was the moment Harlem drew a line that no one dared cross again. But everyone agreed on one thing. After that night, nothing was the same. What the newspapers printed was careful. What the police reported was incomplete. And what the streets whispered was closer to the truth than either. Because this was never about chaos. It was about control. It was about a legend who understood that power did not always announce itself. And a bodyguard who understood exactly when history required a response. And that understanding would soon force the city to reckon with what it had allowed Harlem to become, and who it had allowed to lead it. The consequences were only beginning. By sunrise, Harlem was already awake, and so was the rumor mill. News didn't travel through newspapers first in those days. It moved through barbershops before noon, through church steps after morning prayer, through the quiet nods exchanged between men who understood when not to speak too loudly. Something had happened off 116th Street. No one said exactly what. They didn't need to. Because when a neighborhood like Harlem felt a shift in the air, it meant power had moved, subtly, decisively. And power always left fingerprints. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson had learned long ago that survival in Harlem required balance. Too soft and predators arrived. Too brutal, and the city responded with force. What made him different, what made him dangerous, was that he understood restraint as well as resolve. He paid school teachers when their salaries fell short. He made sure elderly tenants weren't pushed out when landlords got greedy. He stepped in quietly when police pressure crossed into harassment. And when he spoke to downtown figures, he did so with an understanding of leverage that few expected from a man born into Jim Crow America. Bumpy did not beg for respect. He enforced equilibrium. That equilibrium was exactly what had been tested the night before. The city's relationship with Harlem had always been transactional. Politicians wanted votes without responsibility. Police wanted order without accountability. Downtown syndicates wanted profit without consequence. Harlem absorbed the tension from all sides. And Bumpy stood at the center, not as a politician, not as a gangster in the traditional sense, but as something uniquely suited to the moment, a mediator with teeth. which was why his bodyguard mattered more than most people realized. The man had been chosen carefully, not for size alone, not for aggression, but for judgment. He knew when to step forward and when stepping forward would make things worse. He knew how to read a room the way a preacher reads a congregation, and most importantly, he knew Bumpy's rules. Rule 1, never escalate unless escalation was forced. Rule 2, never embarrass Harlem. Rule 3, when action was unavoidable, make it definitive. The bodyguard had followed those rules to the letter, which was why, when police brass convened later that week, they spoke cautiously. The incident could not be ignored. Something public had occurred. Something that demanded explanation, but not exposure. The precinct captain assigned to Harlem was a man who had built his career on order. He believed in visible authority, crisp uniforms, and the idea that neighborhoods bent when pressure was applied correctly. But he also understood something else. Harlem did not break the way other places did. Pushed too hard, and it pushed back. So instead of raids, he requested information. Instead of arrests, he called for reports. And instead of public statements, he sent a message through intermediaries. He wanted a meeting, not with the bodyguard, with Bumpy Johnson. The meeting took place in a borrowed office space near Lenox Avenue, a neutral location chosen deliberately. No crowds, no posturing, just two sides acknowledging that something had changed. The captain arrived with 2 men. Bumpy arrived with 1. The bodyguard waited outside. That detail did not go unnoticed. Inside, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and restraint. The captain spoke first, his tone professional, almost courteous. "There's pressure from downtown," he said. "They want assurances." Bumpy listened without interrupting. "Assurances of what?" he finally asked. "That Harlem won't spiral." Bumpy leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable. "Harlem spirals when it's treated like it doesn't matter," he said calmly. "Not before." The captain studied him for a moment. "And what about what happened the other night?" Bumpy's gaze hardened, not with anger, but with clarity. "What happened," he said, "was a misunderstanding that won't be repeated." The captain understood the translation. The line had been drawn. Outside, the bodyguard remained motionless, aware that his role in the larger story was already being debated by men who would never say his name. He was fine with that. Legends required anonymity around their edges, and he had never mistaken his position for the center, but word continued to spread. Downtown figures recalculated. Street-level operators adjusted their behavior. Even rival crews began settling disputes more quietly, more carefully. Not because they feared chaos, because they feared certainty. Harlem residents noticed too, not in headlines, but in tone. Police patrols eased slightly. Certain businesses stopped being hassled. A few long-standing disputes disappeared without explanation. People didn't credit Bumpy openly. They just walked a little steadier, spoke a little freer. And the story of that night, whatever version people believed, grew heavier with each retelling. Some said the bodyguard had acted too fast. Others said he'd waited exactly long enough. But the truth, as always, lived in the silence between words. For Bumpy Johnson, the night was already part of a longer arc. He understood that legends weren't built by moments alone, but by what followed them. How one handled consequences mattered more than the action itself. And consequences were coming from the city, from rivals, from men who believed power could be reclaimed once it had been challenged. They were wrong again, but they wouldn't realize it until the next test arrived. Because Harlem had spoken, quietly, unmistakably, and the world was beginning to listen. The problem with silence was that it invited men to fill it with their own interpretations. In the weeks following the alley incident, Harlem didn't explode. It didn't riot. It didn't erupt the way outsiders expected it to when violence brushed close to the surface. Instead, it grew quiet. Too quiet. That kind of calm made certain people nervous, especially those who had benefited from disorder. Downtown, a different kind of meeting took place. No press, no records, just men in tailored suits seated around polished wood, speaking in the careful language of people accustomed to buying outcomes. They didn't discuss the bodyguard by name. They discussed precedent. One of them finally said what the others were thinking. If Harlem starts deciding its own limits, he said, we lose leverage. Another nodded. And if Johnson believes he can enforce those limits without consequence, it won't stop at one incident. They weren't wrong. They just underestimated the depth of the problem. For years, Harlem had been treated like a variable, something to be managed, pressured, squeezed when convenient. The assumption was always the same. Push hard enough, and someone would fold. But Bumpy Johnson had never folded. And now, someone close to him had demonstrated that the rules could be enforced swiftly, decisively, without spectacle. That scared people who relied on spectacle. The challenge came disguised as routine. A sudden inspection of businesses known to pay protection. A revived investigation into long-settled disputes. Police presence increased, not aggressively, but conspicuously. It was a message. We are still watching. Bumpy understood the language immediately. He didn't respond with force. He responded with patience, which unsettled them even more. Behind the scenes, rival operators sensed opportunity. Men who had long resented Bumpy's influence began whispering again. They questioned whether his restraint had softened him, whether his reliance on rules had made him predictable. One man in particular, older, embittered, once pushed out of territory he believed was his by right, started testing boundaries. He instructed his people to move louder, to ignore warnings, to provoke reactions. He wanted to see if the legend still had teeth. Bumpy noticed. He always noticed. But instead of confronting the man directly, he sent a message through channels that had existed longer than either of them. A simple reminder. This city remembers who keeps it stable. The rival dismissed it. That was his mistake. The bodyguard sensed the shift before anyone else. He saw it in the way certain cars lingered too long. In the way unfamiliar faces began appearing at corners they didn't belong on. In the sudden tension in rooms that had once been relaxed. Harlem was being tested again, and tests required answers. One evening, Bumpy called him in. No raised voice, no instructions shouted across the room. Just two men sitting across from each other. They're looking for a reaction, Bumpy said quietly. The bodyguard nodded. They'll get one if they keep pushing. Bumpy studied him for a long moment. Not yet, he said. Not until they show the hand. The bodyguard understood. Escalation was not about speed. It was about timing. That hand revealed itself sooner than expected. A community figure, a man known for organizing tenant meetings and mediating disputes, was stopped, searched, and publicly humiliated by officers acting just within the bounds of legality. It was deliberate, and it was visible. Harlem noticed immediately. So did Bumpy. This time, he didn't wait. He arranged a meeting, not with police, but with the rival operator whose people had been seen celebrating the incident too openly. The meeting location was chosen with care. Neutral ground, no weapons displayed, no raised voices allowed. The rival arrived confident, too confident. "You've gotten cautious, Johnson," the man said with a thin smile. "That used to be your strength. Now it's starting to look like weakness." Bumpy didn't smile back. "You're confusing restraint with permission," he replied. The room went still. The rival leaned forward. "I'm saying maybe it's time things were renegotiated." Bumpy's voice remained calm. "Harlem isn't a contract," he said. "It's a responsibility." The rival laughed. "Responsibility doesn't keep territory." "No," Bumpy agreed, "but consequences do." The meeting ended without resolution. That too was a message. Within days, the rival pushed harder, more disruptions, louder moves. He wanted to force Bumpy's hand in public, to make him choose between escalation and appearing ineffective. The city watched. The police watched. Harlem waited. The bodyguard prepared quietly. He checked routes, noted patterns, adjusted routines. Not because he wanted another confrontation, because he understood that some men only learned through finality. The night the tension finally broke, Harlem felt it before it happened. Windows closed earlier, conversations shortened, people stayed closer to home. Bumpy attended a community gathering that evening, a calculated choice. Visibility mattered, and so did resolve. As he exited the building, the bodyguard positioned himself instinctively, scanning the street. Everything looked normal. That was the problem. From across the street, a familiar figure stepped forward. The rival's messenger, too public, too deliberate. The bodyguard's hand tensed, not on a weapon, but on awareness. The man spoke loudly enough for witnesses. "This is your warning," he said. "Next time, won't be so polite." The street froze. Bumpy stopped walking. Slowly, deliberately, he turned. And in that moment, every calculation changed, because this was no longer about pressure. It was about challenge. And challenges, once issued publicly, demanded answers. The bodyguard stepped forward, not aggressively, not hurried, just enough to remind everyone present that boundaries still existed. The messenger faltered, and somewhere in the city, men who had bet on hesitation began to realize they had misjudged the situation. Again. The next move would not be subtle, it would not be quiet, and it would define everything that came after. The street didn't erupt. That was the part outsiders never understood. When power truly shifted in Harlem, it didn't come with chaos or shouting. It came with stillness, the kind that pressed against the chest and made men reconsider every decision that brought them to that moment. The messenger stood frozen, suddenly aware that he had crossed an invisible line. Bumpy Johnson didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He didn't even move closer. He simply looked at the man, and that look carried more weight than any shout ever could. "You've said what you came to say," Bumpy told him calmly. "Now you should leave." The messenger hesitated. That hesitation was the mistake, because hesitation suggested choice. And in Harlem, choice belonged to those who had earned it. He bodyguard stepped forward, not fast, not dramatic, just enough to place himself squarely between the messenger and Bumpy. The street felt narrower now. The crowd that had been pretending not to watch suddenly became very attentive. The messenger swallowed. He tried to recover his confidence. "You think one move changes everything?" he said, forcing a laugh. "You think the city bends because you say so?" The bodyguard spoke for the first time, low, even, unemotional. "This isn't the city bending," he said. "This is the city reminding you where you stand." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the messenger took a step back. Just one. It was enough. Later that night, meetings took place across Harlem. Not the loud kind, the quiet ones. The ones where men spoke carefully and listened more than they talked. Because word traveled fast, and the word was simple. Bumpy Johnson had been challenged publicly, and he hadn't blinked. The rival operator didn't like what he was hearing. He had expected outrage, panic, overreaction. Instead, he saw the discipline, control. That frightened him more than violence ever could. Still, pride is a stubborn thing, and pride doesn't retreat easily. The rival decided to force the issue. The location he chose was deliberate, a packed social club, neutral ground in theory, but symbolic territory in practice, a place where presence alone sent messages. Bumpy arrived without entourage, just the bodyguard. That was message enough. Inside, conversation slowed as they entered. Men who had never met Bumpy personally felt his reputation settle into the room like a change in pressure. The rival stood near the back, surrounded by people who suddenly wished they were elsewhere. He smiled when he saw Bumpy. Too wide, too forced. "You came," he said. "I wasn't sure you would." Bumpy nodded once. "I don't avoid conversations." The rival gestured around the room. "Then let's have one." They stood facing each other. No raised voices, no theatrics. Just truth, sharpened by tension. "You're protecting something that doesn't belong to you anymore?" the rival said. "Times change." Bumpy met his gaze. Times change when people force them to, not when they wish for it. The rival leaned in slightly. "And who's forcing this change? You or him?" His eyes flicked toward the bodyguard. That was the second mistake. The bodyguard didn't move, didn't react. But everyone in the room felt the shift, because the insult wasn't personal, it was strategic, and strategies carried consequences. Bumpy's voice hardened, not louder, just heavier. "You're confusing visibility with control," he said. "And you're endangering people who didn't ask to be part of your lesson." The rival shrugged. "That's the cost of influence." Bumpy shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "That's the cost of arrogance." What happened next unfolded quickly, but not chaotically. A sudden movement near the door, a disruption, a calculated attempt to unsettle the room. The bodyguard reacted instantly, not with panic, but precision. He positioned himself between Bumpy and the disturbance, commanding space without spectacle. The room held its breath. In that moment, history pivoted, not because of what was done, but because of what could have been. And everyone there knew it. Security moved in. The disturbance dissolved. The message had been delivered. But the damage to the rival's credibility was already done. He had tried to expose weakness. Instead, he had exposed his own. Bumpy turned to leave. The rival called after him, desperation creeping into his voice. "This isn't over." Bumpy stopped at the door. Without turning, he spoke. "It was over the moment you made it public." Outside, the night air felt heavier. The bodyguard exhaled for the first time in minutes. Bumpy glanced at him. Tonight wasn't about stopping anything, Bumpy said. It was about showing restraint. The bodyguard nodded. They won't mistake that again? No, Bumpy agreed. They won't. And they didn't. Because by morning, the city understood what had happened. The rival operator's influence collapsed, not through retaliation, but through loss of confidence. Partners distanced themselves. Allies reconsidered. Silence replaced bravado. Harlem had chosen stability over spectacle, and Bumpy Johnson remained its center. The bodyguard became something else that night. No longer just protection. He became proof. Proof that power didn't need chaos to be enforced. Proof that discipline could command fear without ever displaying it. And in the days that followed, the city adjusted accordingly. Because when a challenge fails publicly, it echoes privately. The morning after the confrontation didn't arrive with sirens or headlines. It arrived with silence. That was how Harlem knew something had changed. Men who usually spoke loud in barbershops spoke softly. Phones rang and stopped ringing. Meetings were postponed. Decisions were delayed. Nobody wanted to be the next person to misread the moment. Because power hadn't shifted violently. It had shifted cleanly. And that unsettled everyone who thrived on chaos. The rival operator woke to a different city than the one he'd tried to provoke. Calls went unanswered. A scheduled sit-down was rescheduled indefinitely. A shipment that was supposed to arrive never did. By noon, the message was clear. Harlem had made its decision, not out of fear, but out of trust. Bumpy Johnson spent that morning where he always did, walking the neighborhood, not inspecting damage, not celebrating victory, listening. A shop owner stopped sweeping his doorway when he saw Bumpy approaching. "Morning, Mr. Johnson," he said, nodding with genuine respect. "Morning," Bumpy replied. Nothing else needed to be said. That exchange, simple, ordinary, meant more than any show of dominance ever could. Justice in Harlem didn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes it wore familiarity. Sometimes it looked like stability returning after uncertainty. And sometimes it looked like knowing which battles never needed to be fought. The bodyguard remained close, but his role had subtly changed. People noticed him now, not as muscle, but as signal. A presence that said, "This space is accounted for." Children stopped staring. Elders stopped worrying. Even men who lived by bravado learned to respect boundaries they hadn't respected before. Across town, the rival operator attempted damage control. He spread explanations, half apologies, half threats. None of them landed. Because credibility, once cracked in public, doesn't repair quietly. And everyone knew who had forced that crack without ever forcing the issue. Law enforcement noticed too, not because there had been an incident, but because there hadn't. No disruptions, no sudden surges, no retaliation spirals, just calm. And calm in Harlem meant someone competent was in charge. A precinct captain mentioned Bumpy's name during a briefing, not as a target, as a factor. "He's keeping things steady," the captain said. "Let's not create problems where there aren't any." That was a quiet admission of reality, and it mattered. That afternoon, Bumpy finally addressed the bodyguard directly. They sat in a modest office, sunlight cutting through dusty blinds. "You handled yourself the right way," Bumpy said. The bodyguard nodded. "You taught me that." Bumpy shook his head. "No, I showed you why. You chose how." That distinction mattered, because it was the difference between loyalty and leadership. Justice came not through punishment, but through realignment. Territories stabilized, agreements were honored, old grievances faded under the weight of renewed order. The rival operator didn't disappear, but he was diminished, no longer central, no longer feared. And in that world, irrelevance was the harshest sentence. The community felt the difference almost immediately. Less tension, fewer rumors, more predictability. Mothers let their children stay out a little longer. Shopkeepers invested instead of guarded. Churches focused on service instead of survival. This was the real consequence, not humiliation, but peace earned through authority exercised responsibly. Bumpy understood something many never did. That justice wasn't about proving strength, it was about preserving dignity, especially the community's. Weeks later, the rival finally requested a private conversation. Not a demand, a request. The meeting was brief. No raised voices, no threats, just acknowledgement. And when it ended, the rival left Harlem with less ambition than he arrived, and far more caution. Word of that meeting spread too, but differently. This time, the story wasn't about confrontation. It was about restraint. And restraint, when backed by undeniable power, became legend. The Bodyguard would later be remembered as the man whose single decisive moment reshaped the balance, not because of what he did, but because of what he prevented. Chaos, bloodshed, endless cycles of reaction. Bumpy Johnson continued walking Harlem as he always had, not as a conqueror, as a custodian, and Harlem responded in kind. Because justice, when done right, doesn't announce itself. It settles in, and once it does, people protect it instinctively. The city had spoken, and the legend had listened. Legends are not born in noise. They are confirmed in what follows the noise, when the echoes fade and the city decides what it will remember. In Harlem, memory was selective. It didn't preserve every rumor or retell every confrontation. It held onto moments that rearranged the future. And this was one of them. Years later, old-timers would struggle to explain it clearly. They wouldn't agree on the date. They wouldn't agree on who was present. Some would swear it happened in one location, others somewhere else entirely. But they all agreed on the outcome. After that night, they'd say, things were different. That was the mark of legacy. Bumpy Johnson's reputation had always been formidable. But after that moment, after his restraint became visible power, his name stopped being debated and started being accepted. Not just by rivals, by institutions, by businesses, by people who understood that stability was more valuable than spectacle. The streets adjusted first. You could feel it in the rhythm of the blocks. Deals were cleaner, boundaries clearer. Fewer misunderstandings turned into conflicts. Men who used to test limits stopped testing them, not because they feared consequences, because they respected clarity. Bumpy never claimed credit. That was part of the myth. He didn't correct stories that exaggerated. He didn't deny stories that minimized. He allowed Harlem to tell it the way Harlem needed to tell it, because legends don't control the narrative. They earn it. The Bodyguard, too, became a quiet symbol, not a celebrity, a reference point. Young men would be told, carry yourself like that. Not reckless, not loud, measured, disciplined. The power structure of Harlem evolved in subtle ways. Police engagement became more predictable. Politicians spoke more carefully. Outside interests approached negotiations differently, less arrogance, more preparation. No single policy changed, but behavior did. And behavior was everything. Bumpy Johnson's leadership entered its most effective phase. Not louder, not harsher, sharper. He understood something history often overlooks. The true authority matures. It doesn't need to escalate. It needs to endure. Scholars and journalists would later debate how much influence one man truly held. They'd analyze statistics, compare timelines, question causality. But the community didn't need analysis. They lived the before and the after, and they knew. Church leaders spoke of fewer emergency meetings. Business owners spoke of predictability. Families spoke of calm. These weren't headlines. They were outcomes. And outcomes, more than stories, define legacy. Bumpy aged into his legend with intention. He mentored instead of commanded, advised instead of dictated. He knew his era wouldn't last forever, but he could shape what came next. That night, the one people still whispered about had given him something rare. Not immunity, legitimacy. You could see it in rooms where he no longer needed to speak first, in meetings where others waited for his nod, in negotiations where his silence carried more weight than anyone else's threats. Harlem remembered him not as a man who ruled through fear, but as a figure who understood balance, a guardian of order in a world addicted to disorder. The bodyguard eventually stepped out of the spotlight entirely. No books, no interviews, no corrections. That anonymity became part of the legend too, because it reinforced the truth. This was never about one action. It was about what that action represented. When Bumpy Johnson's name was mentioned years later, it wasn't followed by bravado. It was followed by reflection. People leaned back when they said it, paused, as if acknowledging weight. He kept things from getting worse, someone would say, and that sentence said more than any myth ever could. History often remembers the loudest moments. Harlem remembered the quiet ones, the moments when chaos was possible but avoided, when pride was challenged but dignity prevailed, when power was tested and proven without spectacle. That was Bumpy Johnson's legacy, not a single moment frozen in time, but a shift that never fully shifted back. And that is how legends survive scrutiny, not because they were perfect, but because when it mattered most, they chose responsibility over reaction. History loves explosions. It loves chaos, noise, spectacle, the moments that feel cinematic enough to freeze into myth. But Harlem knew better. Harlem understood that the most important turning points rarely announced themselves. They arrived quietly, settled into the streets, and changed behavior before anyone realized history had moved. That night was one of those moments. A single pull of a trigger didn't just stop a confrontation, it clarified a reality. It reminded everyone watching that power wasn't about impulse. It was about control, about knowing when not to speak, when not to escalate, when to let action, precise and restrained, say what words never could. Bumpy Johnson didn't walk away from that moment as a louder man. He walked away as a settled one. And Harlem followed suit. Because leadership, in its truest form, doesn't demand attention. It commands alignment. It brings order not through fear, but through certainty. People knew where the lines were. They knew who held them. And they knew crossing them would change everything, not because of rage, but because of consequence. That's why the story endured, not because of the act itself, but because of the discipline behind it, not because someone fell, but because chaos didn't rise. In a time when respect was constantly challenged and dignity was routinely denied. Bumpy Johnson represented something rare. A man who understood that authority meant responsibility, that the streets didn't need more noise, they needed balance, and sometimes balance is restored in silence. That's the lesson Harlem carried forward. That's why old heads still pause when his name is spoken. That's why the legend refuses to fade. This wasn't just the story of a bodyguard's decision. It was the moment Harlem learned again that real power doesn't shout. It stands firm, lets the echo fade, and leaves the world permanently altered in its wake. And that is how a legend becomes history.